Having surpassed 1,000 completed anime, it's time to review my old favorites and find out what holds up. I'm Sacrabolic, your envoy of hope, and this is Anime Favorite Search. Fate Stay Night is about 7 mages who summon 7 servants from across mythology and folklore to do a big battle to acquire the Holy Grail, which can grant a wish to both the mage and the servant they summoned from mythology and folklore. Fate Stay Night, specifically this one, adapts the first route of the visual novel of the same name, more specifically the Saber route, which I believe to play that route first, but I haven't played the visual novel myself, so I'm not certain. And from what I have most recently heard, this specific adaptation doesn't even adapt the true ending of the Saber route. The reason I glossed over the plot a little bit is because at this point, I feel like the Fate franchise as a whole has gotten famous enough due to things like Fate Grand Order, Fate Zero, and Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works that I don't think it needs a very long introduction. But when I watched this anime originally, none of those things existed. Or I suppose I should say the anime adaptations for Fate Zero and Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works didn't exist. Because Unlimited Blade Works was like the second route of the light novel, and the novel for Fate Zero came out at about the same time as this anime. But none of the anime adaptations for any of that were out when I watched this originally. This was the only Fate anime. And to this point, this has been my favorite of the Fate anime, and I can only imagine that unless Heaven's Feel completely blows my socks off, it's probably going to remain my favorite Fate anime. It's not even because of nostalgia. It is because throughout the entire franchise, my 2 favorite characters are Shiro and Saber, and this being an adaptation of the Saber route heavily focuses on those 2 characters. In fact, this being the first route of Fate Stay Night actually focuses probably most heavily on the characters for the Fate Stay Night game as a whole, which is to say that like Unlimited Blade Works doesn't necessarily need to focus as much on the characters because they were introduced in Fate Stay Night. And this does a very fantastic job of introducing and exploring a good majority of the characters, letting you know how their motivations are, what their personalities are, what their goals are. The only 2 that I don't think are really explored that well, I should say plenty of them aren't explored well, but the only 2 that don't really get their own dedicated moments, I would say, are probably Ryder, who, due to having Shinji as a master, is heavily held back, so she doesn't really get to do much in this, and Berserker, who is portrayed more as a force of nature that has to be overcome rather than a character himself. But every other character pretty much gets their own dedicated time to shine, or at least certain moments. Like even Lancer, who doesn't necessarily get too much screen time, is only in like 4 or 5 scenes during the entire thing, still has that epic moment where he tries to 1v1 Gil, even though you absolutely know it's fucking hopeless. And even though Archer's not super focused on this, you still got that fight where he takes on Hercules, and he takes down like 5 of his lives, and it's fucking badass. Which, speaking of which, I didn't realize like the first 2 times I watched this, but this anime actually does reveal the identity of Archer in that you do see the duplicate necklace after he dies in the post-credits scene, and you do see Shiro duplicate Archer's Gao. And despite the fact that the second time I'd watched this, I already knew of Archer's identity, obviously not the first time, I do find it interesting that I kind of missed this so many times beforehand, but I do think that I do like the little hints that it puts in there. And Archer is pretty fucking awesome. I love the little romance between Castor and her assassin boyfriend, and I came away with an appreciation for Sakura in this, because she's just like such a good girl, and I don't think I'd ever really taken too much interest in Sakura before. Ilya doesn't get the most focus on. She's sort of like actively antagonistic, and then she just turns evil at the end. But I do have an appreciation for her character, and I do like that she's basically characterized as a little girl who kind of doesn't know better. So yeah, but the major focus in this is Shiro and his beliefs that he doesn't necessarily deserve happiness, and that it is his job and goal to save everyone, I think, in the world, I think is his statements. Really, functionally, it's everyone he possibly can, but he just says, like, everyone in the world. And I love Saber's, like, conflict over her past. But what really gets me about Fate Stay Night is that I'm a sucker for a good romance. And this is basically a romance between Shiro and Saber, who have two opposing ideologies from two different periods of time, sort of learning about themselves and each other and coming together in just this adorable but also tragic romance. Where I will say that Fate Stay Night probably loses me a bit is that there are about 3 dips throughout the show that are sort of tied to something I will talk about in a second, where the show just sort of slows down and gets just a tad bit boring. And this is related to the fact that it sort of overly uses and then storytelling rather than so then storytelling, which is to say that basically things happen because the status quo needs to be shooken up in order for the narrative to progress, rather than necessarily because the narrative is progressing or because of the actions of the characters. So, to explain, at the beginning, the Grail War starts, and then a barrier starts to appear around the school, and then once they deal with that, and then Ilya kidnaps Shiro, and then once that's dealt with, and then Castor appears, and then they deal with that, and then Gilgamesh appears. And none of these actions are tied to the previous actions. Like, Gilgamesh doesn't really have to appear because they were about to deal with Castor. He does appear because they were dealing with Castor, but that's just because Castor happened to say something he didn't like. And Castor appearing, they just kind of meet her in a street. This didn't happen because Ilya's castle fell. And that's sort of how the whole show kind of goes. Things don't necessarily happen because of the actions of the characters getting pushed forward, just because the narrative itself needs to be progressing, which is a sort of not great storytelling. And more to that point, I do have to say, I need to talk about Kotomine in Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was always a character I really liked in Fate Stay Night, especially at the original time I watched it. He sort of won me over when Shiro dupes Caliburn, and so Gilgamesh is like, okay, that's pretty cool, but check this out, I've got fucking Graham. And it's like, oh, you have the sword and stone, I have the sword and the tree. And I'm like, yo, this guy means fucking business. Like, Gilgamesh is cool because he's like the first hero in written recorded history. And he has all of the noble phantasms, which the entire show sort of builds up as a big deal. Like, your noble phantasm is basically the power of your servant. So this guy comes in as this big threat, and he's got this sort of like regal but cool personality type. But now, years down the line, watching this again, my major issue with Gilgamesh is he's not properly alluded to, and he just feels like he's pulled directly out of the creator's asshole because Castor was about to get defeated, and they needed to somehow continue the story because just beating Castor early kind of just ends the Grail War. There is some like parts to it, obviously, that doesn't take into account. Like, this is clearly planned because they had Lancer setting in the background the whole time, but Lancer wouldn't have made for a very good antagonist. But this is also kind of my problem because the entire time, Heracles is sort of built up as the big bad of this, and Ilya is like the most powerful mage in the entire show. And so having her go down just to further Shiro and Saber's relationship and develop Shiro and Saber as characters, it makes sense from their perspective, but doesn't make for a particularly satisfying ending, which is why Gilgamesh and Kotomine kind of get pulled out of their asshole. Now, Kotomine was already implied to be evil, don't get me wrong on that, but Gilgamesh isn't properly alluded to. And I guess the idea is you can't just have Lancer and Kotomine at the end. That wouldn't work out very well. But I still think that's a sort of a flaw in the storytelling. Also, on a side note, I don't remember Gilgamesh's dialogue being this rapey. That could be because I've watched the show multiple times and it's been a different translation every single time. It could also be that I just don't really I didn't pay that much of attention to like how he was saying things before, because looking back, I think it was always been this rapey and I just wasn't noticing. Kotomine, on the other hand, I have a lot less positive things to say because he sort of was shown as the proctor of the entire battle royal, and then he's like, surprise, I'm a villain, which that wasn't particularly surprising. But he's also like, I was behind every bad thing that's happened in the entire series, and also my main motivation is I just want to kill a lot of people. And that doesn't make for a particularly compelling villain, right? His motivation is essentially, well, I'm evil, and that doesn't really add to anything. So, yeah, there's definitely some pacing issues and how the story connects, and the main villains kind of suck, if we're being totally honest. But I think the cast surrounding the show is strong enough to manage to get it through, and I will say that Fate Stay Night is just a combination of basically everything I love, which is it's got mythology, it's got over-the-top, complicated magic system with cool magic powers and cool magic weapons, and it's got a tragic star-crossed romance with two characters I just absolutely adore. Twitch and Discord in the description. I've been Sacrobolic, your envoy of hope. Bye-bye.